when we talk about globalization, and when we talk about how we are really getting interconnected with each other, I don't think it is something new. It has always been happening in the past, and actually our cultures evolved because of interaction. So globalization, as some people think is a new phenomena, I don't agree with that. Probably the pace has changed, but the interconnectedness of human beings and cultures have always been there. And we have so if we talk about this program of BNR, which we have been discussing, in fact, it is based on very much historical connections over land and over sea. And we know that a lot of heritage evolved along these connections, and a lot of interactions have actually enriched human knowledge over time. And when we see the kind of cultural heritage that has been generated through this interaction over land and over sea, especially through Silk Route and through maritime routes, we know that the kind of heritage that has come because of this is both tangible, immovable, which are monuments of various kinds, and also immovable, which have actually resulted from the kind of interaction that I explained before, which are now actually part of many museums which are there in these countries and in the BANR region. And not only the tangible dimensions, but the intangible dimensions have also been very importantly evolved through these interactions. And in fact, when one sees the kind of interconnectedness, one sees that there are a lot of elements that have been borrowed from various cultures when we try and look at these cultural practices, and not to forget the connection of livelihoods that has been established. We have to understand that one of the main reasons why these routes were created was trade and interaction over historical time periods, and it has supported a lot of people. Communities, settlements have evolved around this economic model, which has survived for generations. So there's a lot of meaning in continuing that kind of having that as a basis when we think about new developments. But at the same time, we all know that we are also prone to many natural and human-induced hazards. And as cultures don't have boundaries, and they have been always interconnected, similarly, when we look at our natural hazards, earthquakes, floods, or other cyclones or typhoons, they have not really been following any boundaries as well. They have also been kind of shared by countries as we have been sharing our cultural heritage. So this is just to show how the kind of earthquake vulnerability map of the region. And this is just another map which tries to overlay. If you look at the red dots, these are all the earthquake hotspots across the globe, and all these little green dots and the blue dots are all the World Heritage sites, both natural and cultural. These are all UNESCO designated sites of universal importance. And you can see that around 73% of these World Heritage sites are actually in earthquake prone areas, which means that they are vulnerable, extremely vulnerable to earthquakes. So just we can imagine that the kind of risk that we are living in. And we also have to understand that when we think about cultural heritage, we are thinking of something which is irreplaceable. So if it is lost, you can maybe reconstruct it, but it will never be the same again. So it is something which has to be understood as an irreplaceable cultural resource, like natural resource, which if depleted is very hard to gain back. It will take probably another few generations to get it back. And this is another map where we have overlaid World Heritage cities over vulnerability with regards to the flood vulnerability. And again, we see that many of these red, dark purple dots are those World Heritage cities which are at extreme risk of flooding. And when we talk about climate change and the kind of changes in the climatic patterns, we can imagine that many of these are actually extremely vulnerable, more and more vulnerable. And we have to realize that many of these cities are economic hubs. They generate economy. And so if we can not only look at them as culture, but also as an agglomeration of people, agglomeration of economy, then we know how extreme risk we are facing. And then there are multiple hazards which are follow-up hazards. So for example, if you have earthquakes, they can lead to sometimes landslides, or floods can lead to landslides. So again, this is just a map to show those World Heritage cities which are vulnerable to landslides. So what has been happening now over last few decades, and more we realize how vulnerable our cultural heritage is, and how extreme devastation can happen because of these disasters. And a very recent example has been the earthquake which hit Nepal, which previous speakers have also mentioned, and many of the very important cultural heritage sites, not just on those or which is on the World Heritage or on the national level, but more importantly, heritage which belong to the communities, which was because the cultural life of people was so much interconnected to these places, that loss to cultural heritage didn't only mean that there was loss to these bigger monuments, but it was a disruption of community life, which was revolving around these monuments and these sites and shrines. And we should not forget that economy of Nepal relied a lot on these cultural heritage sites. So it's not just that they were important because of their values, but they were also very much important because of the way they contributed to the economy of the communities and economy of the nation. So, and of course, not just the national level economy, but the livelihoods of the people, which were very much based around these sites. So when we think about the losses that happened because of this earthquake in Nepal, not only these monuments, but the entire settlements, many of those settlements with very important cultural spaces got disrupted or affected badly. Okay, another example of Philippines where there has been this typhoon which has kind of affected a lot of, and then earthquake as well, which happened kind of quite close to each other, which affected these Bohol churches. And a lot of devastation. Actually could see that many of these were badly damaged, and still the recovery process is very painful. We have been having part of some discussions on this recovery of these monuments, because it is extremely time consuming and it is extremely heavy on financial resources. So as has been also mentioned in the past, that if we had thought beforehand, probably we could have thought of averting some of the losses which happened. Now it is very, very difficult to find finances to recover these, and not having finances to recover these means that the businesses that were dependent on these, the revenues that were being generated by these monuments and museums, are being stopped. And so there is actually a very long kind of vicious cycle that one gets in once disasters strike and they affect these cultural heritage sites. So this is another example from Myanmar earthquake in 2012, where again a lot of monasteries were badly affected, and then again the communities had to really look for recovery by their own, because the governance was very poor, at least at that time when this earthquake struck. So another example from Bhutan. So I'm just showing you these examples which just show how vulnerable is cultural heritage in all these countries. And here this was a Zong, a kind of fortress, and this was how it was before, but then this is what happened in 2012. And again, accessibility was very poor, and we have to understand that the infrastructure in many of these countries is not good enough to have accessibility of fire or civic defense agencies who could come and do their services. So even the terrain is very, very difficult. So how to really deal with these issues requires a lot of cooperation and learning from each other, because the kind of buildings, the kind of architecture is also very special. The materials that are used are also very unique. So we can't have, we need to really have solutions which kind of derive from lessons that one can get from all of these. This here in China, where this World Heritage town in Lijiang, actually it has been reported that there have been 4 fires in last 2 years, and in fact one of the fires kind of damaged quite a bit of the historic part of the city of Lijiang, which is again a very important city from the tourism point of view. In fact, I heard that one of the most visited city in China, and the domestic tourism and as well as international tourism is it's very popular. So again, the impact is going to be very long term if a disaster strikes here. Again, what is really important here is that we cannot control these kind of disaster risks through only institutional formal mechanisms. What is really important is the engagement of the people who live in these sites, because they are the ones who are going to be the custodians and who are going to really manage these disaster risks. Okay, another very important town, which is again part of the Silk Route, is Istanbul. And in Istanbul, there has been this fire in the historic railway station in 2010, which was actually happening due to renovation work being done. There was an upgradation going on, and this fire resulted in because of upgradation. And one has to understand that many of these heritage sites need upgradation. You need to make them viable economically, but there are no enough guidance tools available for the people to really do this kind of upgradation in a way which is risk sensitive, where you are not creating risks. In fact, there is a very surprising statistics which says that 70% of the fires in many historic buildings have actually occurred due to upgradation. Because when you bring in new tools, when you do all these welding and new kind of repairs, your infrastructure is not good enough to kind of handle this. And of course, we face more and more of flooding issues, and many of our sites are vulnerable to floods. This is Ayodhya. We spoke about the floods in Thailand. And the floods in Thailand actually also created damage to this site, which is one of the ancient cities, a larger archaeological site, but which is within an urban area. So what is important to understand here is that if we look at the rainfall pattern and the flooding pattern, we see that the number of floods have really increased over last 2 decades or 3 decades. So there are two things happening simultaneously. One is that the intensity of rainfall in a short period of time which comes in, and the second thing is that the urbanization that has happened has actually destroyed the local water systems. So there was a very interesting traditional water system, but because of urbanization happening around it, a lot of these were blocked, so water could not be drained out. So when we think about disaster risk management, we cannot think of them separated from development. In fact, this is very much interconnected. And if we have these sites to work, and if we have to make them sustain over a long time, we have to really think about this, having a development which is conducive for risk reduction. And another thing we have to really understand now is that because of the interface of disaster risks and climate change and the development issues, our disasters are much more complex now. We can't just tell that there is an earthquake risk or a flooding risk or fire risk. I mean, in fact, there are many, many hazards which are interacting with each other and making them very complex. And so one has to really understand and realize this complexity and address it. Okay, I'm coming to another big issue that we face with regards to cultural heritage, and that is when the disaster really happens and the kind of damage assessment needs to be done. The problem that we find, and I'm taking example from Bhutan earthquake, which occurred in 2009, that the characteristics of traditional or historic buildings are very different than new buildings. But so you can see the thickness of walls, the kind of materials that are used are very, very different. And so they would require a specific kind of assessment which is different than for new building. But many times, when you have these kind of damage assessments and loss assessments done, they are not able to distinguish between the needs and the criteria for a historic building or a heritage building and a new contemporary building. And in that situation, many of these are classified as to be demolished or very unsafe, without recognizing that actually you need to put them under separate category. You cannot use the same criteria for their evaluation. Another related issue is, so what happens is that many of these structures which have actually survived well, but they may have been assessed from the same criteria as for the new building, are classified as unsafe. And another problem which is related to this is that the global database that is developed for the loss estimation does not really distinguish between the heritage and the non-heritage buildings. So we find that many times we don't have the data or the statistics which tells us about how much losses have happened to cultural heritage, not only the physical losses, but also the losses that are attached in terms of the economic dimension. So how many people have lost their jobs? How many people have lost their how many monuments or sites have lost their revenues. So these are also the issues where the data or the statistics is not available right now. And it is really important for us, especially also if you think about insurance dimensions, which has not been really looked at so much for the heritage, where a lot of these heritage sites or even objects have very high market value. So thinking about that insurance also needs to be given a specific consideration, which has not been done so far. There is a post-disaster need assessment for culture specifically, but it is not well integrated with the overall damage and loss estimation that is done. So I'm going to conclude with a few initiatives on training and capacity building, which again is an area which requires a lot of work. A lot less work has been done because again you cannot just do it only for heritage professionals. You have to really link heritage professionals with the larger development and disaster management professionals because of the interconnectedness of the issue, and they have to really work together. So this is just one of the programs that has been going on for last 11 years in Kyoto, Ritsumeikan University. There has been also initiatives in several other countries in Southeast Asia. For example, this was one program which was launched in Vietnam by UNESCO, again for several World Heritage cities in Vietnam, for which there was a disaster risk management plan being prepared. So, but there is much more that needs to be done. There are some tools that have also been developed, but then again, the application of these tools becomes an issue. And then not to forget about emergency response, because how our heritage sites can be really prepared to respond if something happens. And we have figured out that in Nepal very much that if the response system is not well developed in advance, a lot more damage happens to heritage after the disaster phase. So how to do continuously drills and monitoring them, not just thinking about human lives, but also thinking about these objects or irreplaceable cultural assets, because they are of very high value, and once lost, you cannot get them back. So you have to actually prepare for them, their evacuation as well, not only the people. This is just some slides from Nepal, just to show you that this was one of the very famous thrones of the first king of Nepal, which had a very high emotional and the economic value for the nation as a whole. And the entire country celebrated when they could take out this throne from this damaged building, because it was kind of buried inside. And the kind of thought process that you have to do beforehand is really crucial, which has unfortunately not been done so much. So this is just taking out that throne. These are several other objects which were kind of rescued from that collapsed building in Nepal. And also many of these architectural elements, which again have a very high value in the market, but the communities really wanted them to be saved, because in the reconstruction, they would like these windows and doors to be put back in their new houses, because this is only what gives them their identity. So how you connect all these issues, which are not really thought by the response and the recovery agencies, is quite critical, and this has to be really integrated. So this is just, and it also makes investing in cultural heritage makes a very strong economic sense, because a lot of these fragments, actually you save a lot of money. If you are looking for new materials, probably you will end up investing much more than if you are able to salvage a lot of these important fragments and reuse them. Not only wooden, so we also found in Nepal that how community actually came forward and wanted to work towards this, because they saw the value in having it retained, which they were kind of very afraid of being losing. So this is just to show you again from Nepal, one of the projects that we did as a rescue project for saving all these fragments from a collapsed or a damaged house. Again, you can see that the community members are really working to save many of these. And of course, how do you have a recovery which is ensuring integrated social and economic dimension as well? Because as I said, even when there was so much damage, people had to carry on their lives and livelihoods. So even then people were not able to visit and there was complete destruction everywhere. The first thing to come up was these kind of small shops where people could start selling, because this was the only way they could rebound or say bounce back. And for them to facilitate that requires a lot more thinking. Another thing was about this museum. So this is another thing I wanted to just highlight, that many of these collections, when they are buried, business continuity becomes very important. So for example, this was a temporary storage that was established because this museum could not be operated. So it was closed for almost 3-4 months. So in order to really start to get people back to the museum, some of those objects had to be saved, and some temporary museum, temporary kind of display had to be created. So again, this becomes really important, and I just conclude by making this point, which is that rebuilding actually cultural heritage really helps in building resilience. So it's really important that we have cooperation in this area. Thank you so much.